Welcome, everyone. We're happy to have you here for our chronic homelessness and HMIS training. We have two of us here from the system administration team, myself, Stacey Holmes, and Danielle Robidet from the King County HMIS team. Our colleague, Mary Shaw, is also on the phone. We have individuals attending remotely and people here in the room with us. A number of agencies represented from across the continuum. Today, we're going to be focused on the ways in which chronic homeless definition overlaps with HMIS data entry and the ways in which that data gets used and the ways in which you can pull it out of the system. We'll be covering the HUD definition of chronic homelessness, the exact definition that we follow, how we enter that information in the HMIS system, sort of where it's collected, and then how it gets used, how we can report out on chronic homelessness, how to pull that data out of the system, and then ways in which HMIS can help support the documentation process. So how we document chronic homeless history for the clients that we're serving. First, I want to start out with talking about why it's important, why this matters that we are focusing a whole training on chronic homelessness. We know that it is a complicated topic. HUD has a very specific definition that we all use as participants in HMIS. There's ways in which somebody's chronic homeless history and chronic homeless status is documented in HMIS. And then there are the ways in which eligibility is impacted. So someone's chronic homeless status and how it feeds into their eligibility. When we're talking about chronic homelessness, we're talking about both someone's homeless history, their housing status and their housing history, and their disability status. Those things together and whether or not somebody meets the definition of chronic homelessness is part of determining vulnerability for dynamic prioritization for coordinated entry. As I referenced before, it helps determine eligibility for services and programs that are specifically for people who have experienced chronic homelessness and who are considered chronically homeless. The data collected in HMIS assists in figuring out whether or not somebody does meet that definition by helping to calculate the number of occasions of homelessness or breaks in homelessness. And as we talk about the definition, that'll make more sense of what we're talking about if that's something that's unfamiliar to you. In addition to sort of feeding into getting a full history of a client's homeless status over time, the HMIS enrollments, so enrollments in shelter, in street outreach, as examples, can act as third-party documentation for the documentation requirements. And again, we'll talk about more of that later. And the living situation data that is collected at the entry to a project on the intake form is part of the self-certification information that is gathered. So there's self-report information gathered from a client at intake, which helps build a client's homeless history record in addition to the actual enrollments themselves in HMIS. So we'll talk more about how that all fits underneath the definition and how that fits into being able to work with your client to piece together a full history, and then how that supports your ability to get the documentation you need to help a client show that they are eligible for certain services and programs.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. First, we're going to start off talking about the HUD definition of chronic homelessness. There are two aspects to the HUD definition of chronic homelessness. There's the period of homelessness that an individual has been experiencing homelessness, in addition to whether or not that individual has a disabling condition. So in order for a client to be considered chronically homeless based on the HUD definition, that individual must either have been homeless for 12 consecutive months without a break. We'll talk in a bit about how HUD defines a break. So they must have 12 consecutive months of homelessness without a break, or 4 occasions in 3 years that total at least 12 months cumulative homelessness in that 3-year period. So they must meet one of those two period of homelessness guidelines and have a disabling condition.
This slide is about defining breaks in homelessness, right? So if a client is with friends or family, if a client is paying for a motel, if a client is in transitional housing and is there less than 7 nights, that is not considered a break in homelessness. So when you're looking at client history, if a client is in a shelter and then stays with friends or family for less than 7 nights and then is back in the shelter, that is considered one continuous episode of homelessness. The same is true of institutions, so jail, hospitals, treatment. If someone is there for less than 90 days, that is not considered a break in homelessness. So if they're homeless, entering treatment, they're there less than 90 days, and then they exit to homelessness, that is considered one continuous episode of homelessness. We've talked a lot about scenarios. I've had 3 that I put here just so we can talk through things. I've made them somewhat intentionally tricky. 1 or 2 of them is straightforward, 1 or 2 of them is tricky. So, client comes to me, they report that they lost housing in January 2018, so 18 months ago, 16 months ago. They report they've been staying in a night-by-night shelter since, with these 3 exceptions. They stayed with friends or family for 10 nights in March of 2018. They stayed in the hospital for 93 days in October 2018, and an agency paid for a hotel for 8 nights in April 2019. And they have a documented disabling condition. Is this person chronically homeless based on the HUD definition? I see no's and yeses. Would someone like to tell me why no? Yes.
Because there's only two breaks.
Correct.
There's only 2 breaks.
Yeah. So when you're looking at the scenario, there's only technically 2 breaks. So you have a period of homelessness here, this break where they stayed with family for 10 nights, a period of homelessness here, this break where they stayed in the hospital for 90 days, and then this is one continuous period of homelessness because an agency paid for these 8 nights in a hotel. If you're doing the 12-month continuous, the clock restarts here at this March, and then restarts here in January 2019 at the end of this break. So they would have to have 12 months of continuous homeless here to count that as 12 months continuous. Okay, any questions connected to this scenario before I move on to scenario 2? Okay, scenario 2. Client comes to me, reports they've been staying in their vehicle since May 2017. They have an outreach contact that verifies that they've been staying in a place not meant for human habitation once a month for the last 12 months. The client reports they do not have a disabling condition and they receive SSI. Is this client considered chronically homeless based on the HUD definition? I see yeses and I see no's. Yes. The comment in the room was that even though the client reports that they don't have a disabling condition, they receive SSI, which for your program can be documentation of a disabling condition. So this client is chronically homeless because they have over 12 months of homelessness. You have documentation from the outreach worker, which we'll talk a little bit about how to use that. But you have documentation from an outreach worker via services in HMIS, and you have SSI as documentation of a disabling condition.
This third client has been staying in an emergency shelter since October 2016, with the following exception. The client always rents a motel room after they receive their SSDI check each month, but never for more than 5 nights, and they were in the hospital for 120 days starting in December 2017. Client reports that they have a disabling condition, but they are not connected to a provider who is willing to document the disabling condition. Based on this information, is this client chronically homeless? Do they meet the HUD definition of chronic homelessness? I'm seeing some yeses and some no's. So the client for this scenario does meet the definition of chronic homelessness. At first glance with this client, it looks like they only have a single break in the past 3 years. That break of hospitalization in December 2017 means that there's only 2 episodes of homelessness in the past 3 years. However, the hospitalization that started in December 2017 actually ends in March of 2018, which was over a year ago at this point. So this client has more than 12 months of consecutive homelessness because that hotel stay is never more than 5 nights, and the hospitalization ended over a year ago. In situations like this, once you've verified that an individual has been continuously homeless for 12 months, you don't need to pursue episodes. The other aspect of this is that the client reports having a disabling condition, but reports they're not connected to a provider who is willing or able to document their disabling condition. However, when you look at this example, you see this client is receiving SSDI, which for the purposes of documentation for programs counts both as income verification and documentation of disabling condition. Any questions?
We're going to come back to this discussion question at the end if we have time. I do want to have some discussion if we have time at the end about tips and tricks that you use in your program, in your agency, to help get a clearer picture of a client's housing history when you're working with clients who may or may not be good historians. So we'll kind of come back to that at the end if we have time. Okay, so moving on to entering homelessness data in HMIS. So for those of you who enroll clients in programs, these screenshots that you're going to see moving forward will look fairly familiar. The question about, so a client comes to me and reports disabling condition. What we're about to talk about is when reports are pulled. So when you're running an APR, when you're running, I think the data quality report, this is where they pull the information to do their calculations about how many people in your program are chronically homeless. So this is separate from the documentation requirements for your program. This is when your funders are looking at your APR, your annual reports to see how many people who are chronically homeless in your program. This is the information that it's pulling from. So this is on your enrollment screen. For that calculation in reports, when you're looking at this screen, you either need to have the client comes to you and reports yes to disabling condition. For the purposes of the reporting calculations, it can be either yes to disabling condition or yes to a specific condition and yes to long-term. So if a client comes to you and says, no, I don't have a disabling condition, but yes, I have a disabling developmental disability, the report will look at the no here and we'll see the yes here, and we'll consider that a disabling condition in terms of reporting. Sure. So there are some reports that go in HMIS that automatically calculate chronic homelessness based on enrollment data in your program. When the report goes through and looks at whether or not a client has a disabling condition based on their self-report when they come and do the enrollment for you, they're looking to see if there's a yes here at disabling condition, or if there's yeses here with the specific disabling conditions and a yes for long-term.
So the first one by itself, or yes for a specific plus long-term?
Yes.
Or all three together?
Or all three. If there's all three, that's fine. It won't ignore that. But yes, one or the other. So a yes for disabling condition or a yes for a specific disabling condition and long-term. Questions?
Okay.
Good. Question.
Well, so this is all self-reported, but you're saying that it still goes into a calculation?
Yeah. So two different worlds. So one world is the report that is run for your program that says, based on client self-report, how many people in this program are chronically homeless. That's where this calculation goes into play. The other piece is, as a housing provider, right, what counts as documentation of chronic homelessness. So this does not count as documentation of chronic homelessness as a housing provider when you need that documentation. it does reflect in your reports about how many clients you've served that are chronically homeless.
Can you give an example of what kinds of reports that you would want that would be from self-reported chronic homelessness versus the officially documented info?
Yeah, so they're,
Well, the APR, for example, right? An APR, the annual performance report that gets pulled for programs for funding and uploaded to HUD. That report gives a number, how many chronic homeless people. The only way it can get that number is by saying how many people have enough history of homelessness in the system, and are they yes or no disabled? That's where it gets the information. Otherwise, it would not be able to, do the calculation and spit out a number. But that would never be enough for proving that documenting that an individual is disabled for the purposes of making them eligible to move into a building.
in your enrollments, you also have questions about living history. So if type of residence prior to entering program this is hospital. So if it's an institution, these two questions pop up about, has that client been there less than 90 days? And if the answer is yes, the client has been there less than 90 days, then this subsequent question of if they were homeless entering the institution also pops up. So this is that they've been in an institution less than 90 days and they were homeless before. This counts as not having a break, right? So this counts as the continuous coming from homelessness. Questions?
There is a question about how do you resolve data errors if the self-reporting documentation does not match up?
Match with
I think this came on the heels of the mismatch, right? You have something.
Yes.
If it depends on the kind of data errors you're trying to resolve. HUD gives guidance that you should update a client's disability status with the current known information, unless the client refuses to have any of their information in the system, or unless it would put the client in danger in some way. So if there is updated information that did not get reflected in the database, then the record their disabling condition should be updated to match whatever the current situation is.
So living situation. If someone reports that there was like a rental, they were prior to entering your program, they were renting a place or they were staying with friends or family, then these two questions pop up. This first one is about, were they there less than 7 nights? And if the answer is yes, they were there less than 7 nights, this second question pops up that says, were they homeless prior to entering? So this is kind of where that data is collected in HMIS. So a client says, there's this whole drop-down list of options about institution, about I stayed in a shelter last night, about rental. And so the ones connected to institution and housing have subsequent questions that pop up that are then used as part of the homelessness calculation. If a client is coming from an institution with a stay of less than 90 days, or coming from a house situation where they were there for less than 7 nights, this information, or they're coming from homelessness, shelter, streets, safe haven, etc. This information is also collected to determine the length of homelessness. So this is a question about the approximate date homeless started. This is the number of times in the past of episodes in the past 3 years. And then this is the total number of months on the streets in emergency shelter or safe haven in the past 3 years. So if a client says they're coming from an institution, they've been there less than 90 days and they were homeless before, if they're coming from a house situation, they're less than 7 nights and homeless immediately prior, or if they're coming from homelessness, a shelter, emergency, safe haven, then the question then comes, how long have they been homeless? So this is also, when talking about reporting, this aspect is also taken into account.
And then the total number of months, that's total number, not consecutive.
Yeah, so this is the start date of their current episode of homelessness. This is how many times, and this is total in the last 3 months or 3 years.
3 years, yeah.
So the 12 months consecutive is based on this date here, right? And then the 4 episodes in 3 years that equal 12 months is based on these 2 questions.
So the date homelessness started is their current instance of homeless, not I've been homeless since 2014.
Yes, so it's their current episode of homelessness, but that doesn't mean like their current shelter stay, right? So if they've been going from one shelter to another shelter to another shelter, that's one continuous episode of homelessness.
So their date of their current consecutive.
Yes. So if a client's been homeless for 18 months, but has been in 5 shelters with no official breaks, it's asking for that date 18 months ago. So this gets back to a question that was asked earlier. For the disabling condition, yes, no, or for the any of that homeless history client self-report, if the answer in the system is unknown, refused, missing, according to the calculations on the reports in the system, the client is not chronically homeless. This gets to what can actually be used. Robert, this gets to your question about what can be used for chronic homeless documentation, essentially. So there is data that is entered into HMIS that's not client self-report that can be used by a program as supporting documentation for that length of homelessness aspect of documenting chronic homelessness. Those examples, those things that can be taken from HMIS and used as part of your supporting documentation for an individual client as a housing program documenting chronic homelessness include, so if a client is enrolled in a night-by-night shelter, any of the bed night services provided to that client count as documentation of homelessness for that time period. So for a night-by-night shelter, if a client stays one single night, has one single bed night service in a night-by-night shelter, that counts for the entire month of documentation of chronic homelessness. I see a question here. Yes.
So say someone goes into shelter tonight and then tomorrow night, does that count for May and June? Then?
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So that's for night-by-night shelters. These are shelters that track each night a client stays there. Oftentimes kind of your larger shelters where if you miss a night, you don't automatically get your bed the following night after you've missed a night. Often that's a good indicator of which shelters are night by night and which are continuous stay. For a continuous stay shelter, that's one where you're allowed to miss a night and you don't automatically lose your bed oftentimes. That's kind of a good distinction between night by night and entry exit. So entry exit shelters, when you're looking at documenting homelessness for a client, for entry exit shelters, that's based on the start and end date of that enrollment, because the assumption is that the client is there that span of the enrollment.
So sometimes, even though there's this concept that if a client is in shelter for one night in a month, then that whole month gets counted. But HUD doesn't always match the report specs to that concept for entry exit type programs. So if you're seeing something on a report and you think, but my project stay started middle of the month, so that whole month should be started, it might be because of the way, there's 2 different ways that HUD asks the reports to be programmed, and there's 2 different ways of counting point in time or project start, and so that might be the issue. So we can help resolve that. We can help you figure out why that might be happening if you find a conflict between those concepts based on a report that spits out of the system. It is a weird variation that HUD presents us with that we have to figure out sometimes.
Great. So street outreach programs, each street outreach program in HMIS has an outreach contact service. And one of the service items, one of the options under that service is this staying on the streets emergency shelter or safe haven. So if an outreach worker goes and sees one of their clients and then enters this service into HMIS saying that they verify that on that day that I saw them, they were staying on Streets Emergency Shelter or in Safe Haven, then that can be counted towards your documentation as a program towards chronic homelessness. And like the night-by-night shelter, it also counts if there's one contact service in a month, that whole month counts as documented. And then, so rapid rehousing / tenant-based housing enrollments, this is more about looking historically, right? So if someone is enrolled in rapid rehousing and hasn't moved in yet, they're not going to get referred to another housing resource because they're already connected to a housing resource. But also they're not currently housed, right? So there's that distinction of, yes, they're housed in that they're not going to get referred to a different housing resource because they're already connected to one, but they're not physically in housing yet. But when you look retroactively, if a client is enrolled in rapid rehousing 2 years ago, and their enrollment date and their move-in date are 2 months apart, and then you're looking back at episodes and total months and 12 months, those 2 months between the rapid rehousing enrollment start date and the rapid rehousing move-in date count as a continuation of homelessness. So it's not until that move-in date in HMIS occurs that that client is considered housed in terms of looking at chronic homeless history, piecing that together. Yes.
So if somebody, for instance, is in rapid rehousing, no, we're not going to refer them to another housing organization set to get a place, but they don't have a moving date yet. Do they count as housed?
They do not count as housed. They are just not eligible for other housing resources at that time.
They're still homeless, they're just in housing.
Correct. This is a client level report. So when you pull up the client profile page, there's a little printer icon over to the right. That's actually a report library for that specific client. That is where you will find this homeless status timeline report. It is color coded and it has the name of each of the programs, program type, and then I don't think that it's very visible, but this little MI right here is the move-in. So the report will show you that this person is enrolled in this housing program. So they were homeless this month, and then the move-in date occurred this month, so they're housed past that. So these green yeses here are when the report can determine that that client was homeless in that month. And then these no's are when the system can confirm that the client was housed in that month. So this report would be a great place to start. In terms of the move-in date, it's within the enrollment itself, but I would start with this report to kind of give you that move-in date. This report can be used as part of your documentation of chronic homelessness. This is not in and of itself documentation of chronic homelessness because it does not have that disabling condition piece of the documentation. But if, say someone was in a shelter for the past 12 months and that showed on this report, you can use this report as your documentation of homelessness. Questions about that? And then one other nuance I want to point out, I can't tell, but I think that this here is an emergency shelter, a night-by-night emergency shelter. And you'll see a little NS here, which means they were enrolled, but there was no service in that time. So the system in and of itself can't determine if the client was homeless in that month because there was no service provided. I think it does the same with outreach programs. Mm-hmm. One thing I will direct you to, when we send out these slides, these 2 links will be live. We did a report spotlight on this report, and there's a step-by-step guide about what the report means, what it looks like, what it says. Yeah, so if you have any questions, the guide's super helpful. Also, feel free to reach out to us. Connected to that report, similar to that report, is the client enrollment details. So this report pulls out a client's enrollment history from HMIS in addition to those self-reported questions, right?
Yeah.
Yes. So this will give you a good foundation for if you need additional documentation, kind of where to seek it out. Because it will give you the snapshot of all of their self-report of history, homeless history as well.
And that is important because there are providers that don't participate in HMIS, right? So you might have a client staying at a shelter and that shelter enrollment is never going to show up in HMIS. So you would want to be able to sort of start piecing that together and get what you need to create a full history and picture for that client.
Again, this is in that same report guide as the previous report. They're in a guide together. This is the client level system use and length of time homeless report. So this is a HUD specified report that gives you checks for if they were documented staying on the streets in a shelter, self-report, a documented break, and a self-reported potential break. This is all based on HUD specifications, and we provided the link in the slides. So if you want to read through exactly what it's looking at, you can do so. These are where it comes to the program level reports. So the previous reports were about individual clients to help document chronic homelessness. This is about your program. So the HMIS data quality report gives you a comprehensive data quality review. And part of that is how many clients in my program, according to HMIS, according to the data in their enrollment, are chronically homeless. For those of you that work with programs where everyone's supposed to be, like everyone is supposed to have documentation of chronic homelessness, this is a good place to look and make sure that HMIS matches the documentation you have. The same is true of the annual performance report. So the HMIS data quality report and the APR closely match each other for kind of the top section about data quality. The APR is a lot of pages of report, and we actually did an entire training on that one single report. We linked that training there. There's also a report spotlight. This goes into a little bit more detail about clients who are chronically homeless, a little bit more than the HMIS data quality report. The APR provides some information about veterans who are experiencing chronic homelessness, which the data quality report does not.
Can you go back to the previous, just
Sure.
to get the number?
These two reports are both under, when you look at the report library, they're both under the HUD report section of the library. Documenting chronic homelessness. So if you're a program that is required to document chronic homelessness for your people who are moving into your program, this is kind of the order of priority. So the preference, the encouragement, the standard is to have third-party documentation. So this is another agency can verify that this client was homeless. Sometimes this can be like food banks, verify that this client is homeless. Observation of an intake worker.
Third party also is the HMIS enrollment
Yes.
itself.
And then the final preference is certification from the homeless individual. HUD allows for a percentage of self-verification of chronic homelessness. Each client, according to HUD guidance, your funders may have different, more strict guidelines, but according to HUD guidelines, every client can self-report, self-verify up to 25% of their 12 months of homelessness. So they can self-verify 3 of 12 months of their homelessness. And then within your program, 25% of the clients in your program are allowed to self-verify all of their chronic homeless history, the time, not the disabling condition, but the time. And again, that is according to HUD and flagging that your funders may have different requirements. Stacy, anything to add to that?
There's a detailed handout that we made copies of that is the HUD handout, the go-to.
Yes.
And I know you're going to show the flow chart, but what
Yes.
Danielle is just talking about is on the other side of the flow chart that talks about those percentages.
Yes. So these are some things that count as third-party verification. For disabling condition, this is verification from a licensed professional or written verification from Social Security, or the disability, the printout they get with their monthly disability check, their SSDI or SSDI check. Documentation, third-party documentation of homelessness. So this is that report, HMIS records, so that report that you've pulled at the client level out of HMIS that shows their history. The written observation of living situation by outreach worker. So if you know that a client's working with an outreach worker and their program isn't in HMIS, they are permitted to sign third-party verification saying that they verify that this client has been homeless for this period of time. Written referral from housing provider, and if applicable, sometimes discharge paperwork comes into play when you're trying to confirm if something is a break or not. Discharge paperwork from an institution will give you a clearer picture of, right, if was this 88 nights or 92 nights. So sometimes that comes into play. I want to be respectful of time, so we're going to fly through these last couple. We've talked a little bit about this. Your first step is to see if they've been homeless for 12 continuous months. If the answer to that is no, then you start looking at episodes. If they've been homeless for 12 continuous months, you don't need to worry about episodes. It doesn't matter at that point. So start with, has this person been continuously homeless for 12 months? If the answer is no, move to, can I identify 4 episodes in 3 years that total the 12 months? This handout that you have, this is a HUD handout. So this is something that they created. This link here, when we send out the slides, will be a live link to the actual handout. On one side, you will see this beautiful flow chart that will help you through determining if a client meets the definition of chronic homelessness in terms of housing and disabling condition. This back page offers you some information about what counts as documentation of chronic homelessness. Upcoming trainings, office hours in a couple weeks, and then towards the end of June, registration and information still to come out soon, but will be a specific training regarding rapid rehousing and HMIS. So if you work for a rapid rehousing program, we encourage you to attend this one as well. Registration will go out probably early next week. Being respectful of time, I'm going to thank everyone for attending and say that we will be around for questions.
Absolutely, and thank you to our online audience for hanging in there with us when we lost our Wi-Fi there. Feel free to post any last minute questions you have here. This is, you can imagine we could spend all day on talking about chronic homelessness and all the layers. So feel free to reach out. We'll have some more resources in the email that goes out because there's a lot of resources out there, including some HUD webinars, short little HUD webinars that they have on their site that are worth watching with this, now that you've attended this one.
Yeah, and then 2 final notes before we part ways. Stacy and I both have business cards up there, and also our help desk email is at the bottom of your agenda. They are also a great resource if you have any questions HMIS related. Thank you all for coming. Have a wonderful day.